Deep connections are not random encounters or coincidences of timing, but expressions of the psyche recognizing something within itself through another form. In Jungian psychology, the unconscious is not passive, it actively seeks wholeness. When you meet someone who feels instantly significant, it is often because an inner archetype has been activated. This means the mind is not only responding to the external person, but also to an internal image that has long existed beneath awareness. The connection feels powerful because it bypasses rational filtering and speaks directly to the unconscious layer of the psyche, where symbols and emotional truths operate. In this sense, the experience is less about the other person being destined and more about the psyche projecting unintegrated aspects of itself onto them. What feels like recognition is actually the mind encountering parts of itself that have not yet been consciously owned. This is why such connections often feel intense, confusing, or even overwhelming, because they carry emotional weight far beyond the present moment. Jung would suggest that these experiences are not illusions, but meaningful psychological events. However, their meaning is not external fate, but internal development. The intensity of the bond reflects the depth of unconscious material being activated. As a result, the connection becomes a mirror, revealing not only attraction, but also unmet needs, hidden fears, and potential for transformation. The real significance lies in how the psyche uses the connection to move toward greater self-awareness, not in the permanence of the bond itself. The psyche often projects what it has not integrated onto another being, meaning that qualities, emotions, or inner traits that remain unconscious within an individual are experienced as if they belong to someone outside. In Jungian terms, this is closely related to the concept of projection, where the mind relocates parts of the self that are not yet accepted or understood and attaches them to an external figure. This process is not deliberate. It happens automatically as the psyche tries to create a sense of wholeness. When something within us is unrecognized or unresolved, it does not disappear. Instead, it seeks expression through perception. So when a person encounters someone who seems unusually compelling or emotionally charged, they are often not reacting purely to the other individual, but to the qualities that person is carrying as a symbolic container for their own unconscious material. The attraction, intensity, or even discomfort arises because the mind is interacting with its own hidden aspects without realizing it. This is why projections can feel so real and convincing. The emotional response is genuine, but its source is internal rather than external. Over time, as awareness develops, the projection begins to dissolve, and the individual starts to differentiate between what truly belongs to the other person and what was always part of their own psyche. Jung considered this a crucial step in individuation, because reclaiming projections allows a person to become more whole and less dependent on external figures to carry their inner world. What feels like destiny is often the activation of archetypal patterns within the unconscious, meaning the experience is shaped less by external fate and more by deep psychological structures that exist universally within the human mind. In Jungian psychology, archetypes are inherited patterns of perception and emotion that form the foundation of how we experience relationships, meaning, and identity. They are not personal memories, but collective templates that influence how we interpret reality. When a certain encounter feels fated or unusually significant, it is often because an archetype has been triggered in the unconscious. For example, the archetype of the anima or animus can project powerful emotional meaning onto another person, making the experience feel larger than life. The individual is not only responding to the person in front of them, but also to a deep inner pattern that has been activated and is seeking expression. This activation creates a sense of recognition, urgency, or inevitability. The psyche begins to organize experience around symbolic meaning rather than rational explanation. That is why the feeling of destiny can be so convincing. It is rooted in a layer of the mind that operates beneath conscious logic. However, Jung would argue that this sense of fate is not external orchestration but internal activation. The archetype gives emotional intensity and symbolic weight to the experience, making it feel meaningful and guided. Yet the real process taking place is psychological development, where unconscious patterns are brought into awareness through relational experience. The sense of destiny is therefore the psyche's way of drawing attention to something within that is ready to be understood and integrated. Doubt arises when the ego tries to control what the unconscious already understands, meaning the conflict is not between truth and falsehood, but between two levels of awareness operating at different depths. In Jungian psychology, the ego represents the conscious mind, the part that seeks order, logic, and certainty. The unconscious, however, operates through symbols, feelings, and intuitive knowing that do not always align with rational explanation. When a powerful emotional or psychological connection occurs, the unconscious often registers its meaning immediately, while the ego lags behind, trying to interpret it through familiar categories. This creates tension. The ego demands evidence, structure, and clarity, but the unconscious communicates through subtle recognition and emotional resonance. As a result, doubt emerges as a protective mechanism. It is the ego's attempt to regain control over an experience that feels too vast, too ambiguous, or too transformative to be neatly defined. The mind begins to question what the deeper psyche already perceives as meaningful, not because the experience lacks value, but because it exceeds the ego's capacity to fully grasp it. Jung would suggest that this internal conflict is a natural part of psychological development. The unconscious is not confused. It simply operates on a different language. The ego's doubt reflects its discomfort with surrendering authority to something it cannot fully rationalize. However, when the ego becomes too dominant, it can suppress valuable inner signals, creating disconnection from intuition and deeper emotional truth. In this dynamic, doubt is not necessarily a sign of inaccuracy, but a sign of transition between conscious certainty and unconscious knowing, where the psyche is pushing the individual toward a broader awareness that has not yet been fully integrated or accepted. The feeling of knowing someone before actually knowing them is often a psychological event rooted in projection and unconscious recognition rather than literal pre-existing familiarity. In Jungian terms, this experience occurs when the psyche projects inner images, especially archetypal ones, onto another person, creating an immediate sense of familiarity or emotional significance. The mind is not responding solely to the external individual, but to internal content that has long existed within the unconscious. This sense of recognition can feel strikingly real because the unconscious does not operate through logical sequencing or time-based understanding. It works through patterns, symbols, and emotional resonance. When someone appears who activates a deep inner structure, the psyche reacts as if it has encountered something already known. This is not memory in the traditional sense, but a symbolic alignment between inner psychological material and external perception. Jung would suggest that this experience often involves the projection of archetypes such as the anima or animus, which carry emotional expectations, ideals, and unresolved inner dynamics. The person in front of you becomes a canvas onto which these unconscious contents are projected, creating a powerful illusion of prior connection or destiny. The emotional intensity of this experience reinforces the belief that the connection is unique or preordained. However, as psychological awareness increases, this initial knowing can be re-examined. What seemed like recognition of another person is often revealed to be recognition of parts of the self that had not yet been consciously integrated. The experience becomes less about external familiarity and more about internal discovery, where the psyche uses the encounter as a way to surface unconscious material that is ready to be acknowledged and understood. Synchronicity, in Jungian psychology, refers to meaningful coincidences that appear to have no causal relationship but feel deeply significant to the individual experiencing them. When something feels like fate aligning, it is often because the psyche is organizing perception around inner psychological states, not because external events are being directly orchestrated. Jung proposed that the mind and external reality can sometimes mirror each other in a way that creates symbolic alignment, where inner emotional intensity seems to be reflected in outer circumstances. In such moments, the individual experiences events as if they are connected by meaning rather than logic. This happens because the unconscious is not bound by linear time or physical causality. It operates through patterns and symbolic associations. When a strong inner focus, emotion, or unresolved psychological tension exists, perception becomes highly sensitive to external cues that appear to match that internal state. As a result, unrelated events can feel connected, as though they are part of a hidden order. Jung did not claim that synchronicity proves external destiny, but rather that it reveals a correspondence between the inner and outer worlds. The experience feels powerful because it bypasses rational analysis and directly engages the symbolic mind. The ego interprets this as fate because it cannot easily explain the alignment through conventional reasoning. However, the deeper implication is psychological rather than supernatural. Synchronicity reflects moments when the unconscious becomes highly active, shaping perception in a way that highlights personal meaning. It is the psyche drawing attention to internal processes by projecting significance onto external reality, creating the impression that life itself is responding to inner transformation in real time. Fear in connection is not a signal that something is wrong externally, but often a reflection of the ego encountering material that threatens its established sense of identity. In Jungian psychology, the ego maintains stability by holding together a coherent narrative of who I am. When a deep emotional connection activates unconscious content, especially unresolved emotions, vulnerabilities, or shadow aspects, the ego experiences this as disruption. That disruption is felt as fear. This fear does not necessarily come from the connection itself, but from the internal psychological movement it triggers. When someone begins to matter on a deep level, they can unconsciously activate attachment wounds, fears of loss, rejection, or loss of control. The psyche starts revealing parts of itself that were previously contained or avoided. Because the ego is not accustomed to holding this level of emotional openness, it interprets the intensity as danger rather than transformation. Jung would describe this as the confrontation with the shadow and unconscious complexes. The presence of emotional closeness can dissolve psychological defenses that were previously keeping discomfort out of awareness. As those defenses weaken, buried material rises, and the ego reacts by trying to reassert control, often through anxiety, doubt, or withdrawal. However, this fear is not a rejection of the connection itself, but resistance to change. The psyche is attempting to expand beyond its previous limits, while the ego resists that expansion to preserve familiarity. In this sense, fear becomes a threshold experience, marking the boundary between old psychological structures and emerging awareness that has not yet been fully integrated or accepted within the self. True connection, in a Jungian sense, is not the merging or dependence of two individuals, but the process in which each person is compelled toward greater psychological wholeness through the encounter. This is closely tied to Jung's concept of individuation, where the goal of psychological development is not attachment, but the integration of unconscious and conscious aspects of the self. When a deep bond forms, it can easily be mistaken for dependency because of the emotional intensity it generates, but its deeper function is actually to push both individuals towards self-awareness. Dependency occurs when one psyche relies on another to carry or compensate for its own unintegrated parts. In such cases, the relationship becomes a substitute for inner development, where validation, identity, or emotional regulation is outsourced. This creates imbalance because the unconscious material projected onto the other person is never reclaimed by the individual. The connection feels consuming, but it does not lead to inner growth. Individuation, however, transforms connection into a mirror rather than a crutch. The presence of another person triggers unconscious material, but instead of clinging to the external figure, the individual is invited to recognize and integrate those inner dynamics within themselves. This makes the relationship a catalyst rather than a dependency structure. Jung would argue that the strongest psychological bonds often create tension precisely because they challenge existing identity structures. They expose unconscious patterns, forcing the ego to evolve. In this way, true connection does not reduce individuality, but strengthens it. The purpose is not to complete the self through another, but to become more fully oneself through the psychological impact the connection creates, allowing both presence and separation to coexist without loss of inner stability. What we often call love is, in Jungian psychology, frequently the meeting point where unconscious wholeness seeks recognition through another person. This does not reduce love to illusion, but reframes it as a psychological process in which the unconscious projects its unmet potential onto external reality. The psyche carries within it a natural drive toward wholeness, and when that wholeness is not yet conscious, it seeks expression through relationships that feel emotionally charged and deeply meaningful. In this process, the individual is not simply responding to another person as they are, but to the symbolic representation of what is missing or undeveloped within themselves. The intensity of emotional attachment often reflects the depth of unconscious material being activated. Idealization, longing, and emotional urgency arise because the psyche is attempting to experience its own wholeness externally before it has been fully integrated internally. Jung would describe this as the projection of archetypal content, particularly the anima or animus, which carries qualities of emotional completeness, creativity, intimacy, or depth. The external figure becomes a mirror for these inner qualities, creating the feeling that love is something found rather than something recognized within. Over time, this projection can either remain unconscious, leading to dependency and repeated patterns of longing, or it can be withdrawn and integrated, allowing the individual to recognize those qualities as part of their own psyche. When this happens, love shifts from projection to awareness, and the relationship becomes less about filling a psychological gap and more about conscious interaction between two whole individuals who are no longer carrying each other's unconscious material. Emotional intensity in relationships is often not just a measure of affection or compatibility, but a signal that deeper unconscious material has been activated. In Jungian psychology, what feels overwhelmingly strong emotionally is frequently connected to unresolved psychological content that has been brought to the surface through relational experience. When another person triggers a powerful internal reaction, it is not only about their presence, but about what their presence awakens within the psyche. This activation can include unmet needs, repressed emotions, childhood attachment patterns, or shadow aspects of the personality that have not yet been consciously integrated. The intensity arises because the unconscious is no longer contained. It is now interacting with conscious awareness through emotional experience. The individual may feel deeply drawn, anxious, confused, or euphoric, often oscillating between extremes, because multiple layers of the psyche are being stimulated at once. Jung would suggest that emotional intensity is a form of compensation from the unconscious. When something important within the psyche has been neglected or unacknowledged, it tends to express itself with greater force when a suitable external trigger appears. The relationship becomes a stage where inner conflicts are played out symbolically, even though it feels like it is entirely about the other person. This is why emotionally intense connections can feel transformative or destabilizing. They are not neutral interactions, they are psychological events that reveal hidden structures of the self. The intensity is not proof of external destiny or compatibility, but evidence that something within the individual is demanding attention, integration, and conscious understanding through the relational experience being lived in the present moment. Trust in connection, from a Jungian perspective, is not about blind belief in another person or in external signs, but about developing conscious awareness of the unconscious processes that are shaping the experience. It requires the individual to differentiate between projection, intuition, and ego-driven fear, rather than surrendering entirely to emotional intensity or dismissing it as meaningless. The unconscious often communicates through feelings, symbols, and subtle inner knowing that do not initially come with rational justification. When a strong connection is experienced, there may be an internal sense of significance that feels undeniable but cannot yet be logically explained. Trust, in this context, means allowing that inner signal to exist without immediately forcing it into rigid interpretation or rejection. It is a willingness to stay present with uncertainty while observing what is being activated within the psyche. However, Jung would caution that not all inner intensity is pure intuition. The unconscious also contains projections, unresolved complexes, and archetypal distortions that can create powerful emotional illusions. Therefore, trust must be balanced with self-awareness. The individual is invited to ask not only what they feel, but also what within them is being awakened through the connection. This form of trust is not passive, it is reflective. It involves observing patterns, emotional responses, and inner conflicts without immediately assigning external certainty to them. Over time, this allows the person to see more clearly whether the experience is guiding them toward integration or entanglement. True trust, in this sense, is alignment with inner psychological truth, rather than attachment to external interpretation or immediate emotional conclusions. The deepest psychological bonds function as mirrors because they reflect unconscious aspects of the self that are not yet fully recognized or integrated. In Jungian psychology, this mirroring is not symbolic in a superficial sense, but structural to how the psyche develops through relationship. When a strong emotional connection forms, it activates inner material that has remained hidden, often bringing it into awareness through projection onto another person. What is seen in the other is frequently a reflection of what exists within, but has not yet been consciously claimed. This mirroring process is not always comfortable. It can reveal unresolved emotional patterns, hidden desires, insecurities, or potential aspects of personality that have been neglected. The other person becomes a psychological surface onto which the unconscious projects, meaning allowing the individual to encounter parts of themselves indirectly. This is why such connections often feel intense or transformative, because they are not only interpersonal, but intrapsychic experiences unfolding through relationship. Jung would suggest that the purpose of this mirroring is individuation, the gradual integration of unconscious content into conscious awareness. Through relational experience, the psyche is given the opportunity to recognize itself in fuller form. However, this requires the ability to distinguish between the external person and the internal projection being activated.